Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to this webinar on strengthening flood resilience in Texas, hosted by Texas 2036 and the American Flood Coalition. My name is Jeremy Mazur. I'm the Director of Infrastructure and Natural Resources Policy here at Texas 2036. Now, nearly 100 years ago, a Texas state meteorologist famously observed that Texas is a land of perpetual drought visited by the occasional biblical flood. And if you've been here for any period of time, you certainly know that's true. But the devastating floods in the Hill Country last summer served as a stark reminder about the importance of state and local flood resilience. And Texas 2036 is honored and excited to partner with the American Flood Coalition this afternoon to host this webinar to explore best practices in flood resilience policy with lessons learned from leaders in Florida and North Carolina. And both our organizations would like to thank the House and Senate members and staff for taking the time to be with us here today. Also like to thank Senate Chairman Charles Perry and House Chairman Cody Harris for helping us share this event within their respective chambers. And we're honored to have Senate Chairman Perry here with us for a few moments to offer some opening remarks. Chairman, thank you for joining us this afternoon for Lubbock. Just want to turn it over to you for a couple seconds.
Well, Jeremy, I appreciate you having it. I appreciate your organizing. I appreciate your organization on so many fronts, but specifically water world that we live in Texas. That said, flooding is a three-legged stool of our larger water planning, if you will, in Texas. We've got supply, we got leaky pipes, and then we have floods. And we try to put money to any of that and all of that, not near as consistently, but that changed as of 1/1/27. We will have $1 billion going into those three initiatives. And hopefully what we did is gave the flexibility to the board to match federal dollars when there was matches available and kind of extend and be a force multiplier. So we're in a pretty good spot going forward once that money starts rolling in. And flooding is a consistently conversation in the Texas legislature in every session prior to the change that we made where we put flood as part of the bigger water picture. A lot of confusion at 181 members. When we do something in water, they think that's everything in water. And honestly, flood is not one of those things that come to people's mind until it's too late. I tell people, your group and people that are on this video, we're the people that work on things that don't matter until they do. That most people don't think about them until it's too late to deal with we're dealing with the aftermath of consequences. So it takes deliberate thought. It takes a lot of coordination. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. When you're fixing pipes and infrastructure, you can have a flood focus to that. How can we do better at flood planning when we're replacing pipes? When you're doing supply development, a lot of times supply and flood go hand in hand. How do you capture the surplus rains and water that comes down floods and keep it for future use as a supply? So the coordinated effort, watershed planning that we adopted back in 2017 has now come to fruition, where we're not just moving water from one neighbor to the next and calling it good. We're actually coordinating with the whole river basin, watershed basin up and down the line, so that we're not just moving our problem from one neighbor to the next, but we're actually dealing with the consequences. Flood is one of those things that cost. They're preventive in nature as far as possible cost savings, eliminating some of the damage, but most people don't see it as that way. It's not a lot of love, and there's no revenue stream for flooding, right? Where we have water supplies, we have fees and taps. Where we have leaky pipes and infrastructure, that's tied to fees and taps and rates and things. So flood is unique in that sense. It's almost a direct appropriation to deal with, and that's been the challenge for flooding across this country. It's not something you get immediate bang for, and it's not something you typically attach to a taxpayer's dollar by fee or by tax. So that's why it's important for your group and groups like you to continue the focus and shine a light on those things that we know will come, and hopefully be better prepared for what you guys do.
Wonderful. Hey, Chairman, thank you so much for being with us here this afternoon. Thank you for joining us for Lubbock. And thank you also for your leadership in the legislature. I think the work that you've done setting up the Texas Water Fund, as well as Proposition 4 with the dedicated funding for not only water infrastructure, but also flood infrastructure, really goes far towards setting up Texas with a strong, smart financial strategy for addressing these challenges moving forward.
Well,
So,
I appreciate you for that, and coordination and conversation. That's
uh,
what we look forward to in our water planning, right?
yes, sir. More of that to come.
Have a good day, guys. Thank y'all for signing in.
Thank you, Chairman. So before we dive into this afternoon's agenda, we have a couple housekeeping things to share. First, we hope to do some Q&A towards the end of this program, time permitting. Please feel free to use the chat feature on Zoom to share your thoughts or questions, and we'll try to get to them at the Q&A portion at the end. And this slide shows you our agenda for the next hour. We'll start with a presentation from Dr. Ruth Akintoye about the American Flood Coalition's flood resistance framework. From there, we'll go to North Carolina. We'll hear from State Representative Mark Pless, who represents Western North Carolina, about the changes made there to improve flood resilience in the Tar Heel State. And then next, we'll hear some lessons learned from the Sunshine State, from former Florida House Speaker Chris Sprowls. And then we'll come back to Texas, where Jeff Walker, the former executive administrator for the Texas Water Development Board, will talk about our state's progress towards flood infrastructure funding and flood infrastructure planning. And again, if there's time at the end, we'll open up this webinar to Q&A. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat feature at the bottom of the screen. So we'll go to our first panelist, which I'm excited to hear from. That is Dr. Ruth Akintoye. She is the Associate Director of Adaptation Strategy at the American Flood Coalition. And her work contributes to AFC's long-term strategy for promoting risk-informed resilience planning at all levels of government. She received her PhD in environmental science from LSU, Louisiana State University. It's not far from Texas. Ruth, thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks so much, Jeremy, and also a big thanks to my teammate, Matt Schaefer. I know the two of y'all led in the coordination of this event. Thanks to Senator Perry for his words, and a big thanks to all of the speakers that will be following me. Lastly, I do want to thank all of you out there. Many of you are already familiar with flooding because flooding is a very personal issue. In the aftermath of a flooding event, families are unable to access their homes due to mountains of debris. It only takes a few inches of flooding for a small business owner, your favorite local coffee shop, to get flooded, and in the hole several thousands of dollars, wondering how are they going to survive, how are they going to afford their livelihood. And so flooding is personal because it affects our homes, our roads, our hospitals, and our communities. On the next slide, you'll see that it's for these reasons that we do the work that we do at the American Flood Coalition. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that collaborates with partners at all levels of government, ultimately to advance transformative policies and implementation strategies that will address flooding. With over 500 members nationwide, our members are essentially including, you can stay on the last slide. Our members are essentially including everybody that is on the front lines of flooding. So that includes cities and towns and elected officials. That includes civic organizations, military leaders, and we also recognize over 50 federal champions on this issue. I do want to note that we're completely philanthropically funded. Membership is completely free and we don't do government contracts. I say all that to say that we really don't have a vested interest in working with you all. Our interest is truly in the subject matter and ultimately in protecting people and property from flooding. Next slide, please. You'll see here that in Texas, we have over 50 members and federal champions from the former as well as incoming presidents of the Texas Municipal League to Mayor Scurro of Portland, Texas, U.S. Representative Dan Crenshaw, and State Senator Judith Zaffarini, to name a few. Our main office is in D.C., and while we do have team members that are based in different states, we ultimately know that we can't be everywhere. And that's why we really value the deep relationships that we hold with all of our members, as well as trusted partners like Texas 2036. And this is ultimately to ensure that the work that we're doing is grounded in state and local realities. Next slide, please. Some of our engagement in Texas has included being a part of Texas-based water coalitions, one of which was led by Texas 2036 and was already mentioned on this call, how a lot of their advocacy has led to over $4 billion in funding for flood and water, including the $1 billion of recurring of funding that is now reality in Texas due to the legislature and also the votes of Texans statewide. We've also engaged on the development and the implementation of the state flood plan, submitting comments and serving as technical advisory members on several TWDB projects. Now, I say this very sensitively that we've had the unique opportunity after the devastating flooding on July 4th in Central Texas. We had that opportunity to bring trusted partners. These were local elected officials in Western North Carolina that were also highly devastated by flooding after Hurricane Helene. And they came to show support to the local leaders in Kerrville and Kerr County. And for me, that visit was just one example of showing how cross-cutting and widely relatable this issue is. This painful issue is, really. Next slide. I'll be transitioning to why watersheds matter and the state's unique role. Next. So first of all, definition. A major watershed is essentially a large area of land where all the water from rain, from streams, smaller tributaries is eventually flowing into a single water body. On the left, you see this map of the 15 regional flood planning groups that Texas has established, which are mapped to align with the boundaries of the state's major river basins, or essentially the major watersheds. One thing I want y'all to note is that they cover the entire state because anywhere that it can rain, it can flood. There's no city or county that's left out of that. These watersheds also cut across city and county lines, meaning that flooding does not respect jurisdictional boundaries. Now, I want you to imagine zooming into just one of these regional flood planning groups on the map. And that's what will take us to this image on the right, which is an oversimplified watershed diagram. And what I want to highlight is how at the top, upstream, you see that rain can fall and it can actually cause flooding downstream in communities that never even saw the storm. All that to say is that since flooding essentially follows watersheds and not political boundaries, flood solutions are more effective when projects are considering the impacts across the entire watershed. And this requires communities to collaborate regionally and also to coordinate with the state. Next slide, please. So many systems and grant programs are essentially set up for cities and counties to be applicant. You don't really see the existence of something like a watershed entity that's able to win and procure grants to implement projects. But I'd like to think that with the right systems in place, a watershed approach can turn fragmented efforts that cities and counties are doing into a more strategic, coordinated, statewide resilience planning that ultimately is going to promote fairness because it's aligning projects across upstream and downstream communities within a watershed and watersheds across the state. It's also saving money because it's reducing overlapping and duplicative efforts, and it ultimately improves decision-making. Next slide. At the end of the day, states are the cornerstone for effective flood resilience. They're uniquely positioned to alleviate the burden on locals, to coordinate projects across watersheds, to align priorities. And right now, the federal government is shifting more responsibility for disaster preparedness as well as resilience to the states. As a result, states that have proactive and well-developed strategies will appear to be positioned to have a competitive advantage to securing a larger share of federal funding. Additionally, states are already allocating federal and state funding streams, and so they already are best positioned to ensure that all of these investments are working together rather than in isolation and ultimately stewarding taxpayer resources. Next slide. Now, we created the State Flood Resilience Framework to turn the abstract and buzzword of flood resilience into actionable principles and policy solutions that can apply to other hazards as well. A few things I want to note is that we created this with other state leaders And I'm not going through the whole framework today. I'm just going to briefly highlight the 5 core components that make up our framework. By request, I would be happy to share the full framework with you. It's only a few pages, not 100, just a few. So feel free to reach out if you'd like that. And then one other caveat is we understand that there is no one size fits all solution. This is just helping to shape discussions. So we believe that a single leader, whether that's a person or an agency, should be empowered and accountable to everyone in the state and have a 360 view of flooding. They need to have the authority as well as the resources to fully address the issue, including rallying other agencies and even setting statewide priorities. We believe that good data ultimately is going to give us a true picture of what's at risk so that we can implement solutions that can actually handle the risk that we face today, not what was happening yesterday. We need not only a state plan, but one that sets a strategy for addressing the risk that we've discovered from all the good data that we have. And then funding and financing for the projects that will ultimately reduce our risk according to the strategy we laid out. As you can see, these all connect. And then incentivizing standards and practices that consider flooding, improve insurability, and ultimately protect taxpayer investments long-term. Next slide. This slide is not meant to be read line by line, but it just shows you that for each core component of resilience, practical set of legislative options that can be tailored and applied in a way that is practical. Many of these solutions can be implemented incrementally, building on, honestly, the very strong foundation that Texas already has, but also addressing any gaps in the system. Next slide. At AFC, our team is 40. We're not the smallest and we're not the largest, but I like to say we are just the right size to have delivered real wins across states. We leverage our wide-ranging expertise, making sure lessons learned aren't siloed within states. So states like Texas can benefit from another state's wins, as well as some of their mistakes. Some of the ways that we're already supporting states includes crafting templates for flood resilience programs and policies, sharing best practices, research, data insights, and smart policy. For smart policy, providing input on resilience plans, writing op-eds that shape public understanding, and also serving on technical advisory committees. Next. Now, thanks to the legislature, TWDV, TDM, GLO, and several other stakeholders in the state, Texas is already a leader in how states approach flood resilience. Yet, we all know that resilience is not static and it never fully gets checked off. AFC sees ourselves as partners to leaders like you all to ultimately help save lives and preserve the prosperity of Texas for generations to come. On the screen here, you see a picture of Brody. She's our State Government Relations Director and the point of contact, should you have any future follow-up, hopefully. Anne has a wealth of experience, including leading as the Director of Public Policy and Research at the Council of State Government's Southern Office. And she will also be joining us for the Q&A portion of this webinar. Finally, I'd like to say that I was raised in the northeast parts of this country, but I am a Texas native. And as such, thanks y'all, and I appreciate your time. Over to you, Jeremy.
Hey, thank you, Ruth. And I just have to say, you're working with AFC for the past several years on flood issues. You guys have been a wealth of knowledge and expertise and great policy insights when it comes to getting flood strategy and flood infrastructure and planning right. Now we'll shift our attention to North Carolina. We're honored to have State Representative Mark Pless up next, and he has served in North Carolina House of Representatives since 2021. His district is in western North Carolina, which was devastated by Tropical Storm Fred in 2021, and more recently by Hurricane Helene in 2024. And so Representative Pless is certainly on the front line of resilience efforts in North Carolina. He entered public service long before holding elected office in 2021, after spending nearly 30 years as a volunteer firefighter and more than 2 decades working in emergency medical services. Representative Pless, it's great to have you here. I've spent a lot of time in Western North Carolina along the banks of the French Broad River. We're really happy to have you join us. Look forward to learning from you this afternoon.
Thank you very much for having me. Can you hear me okay? The wind's blowing a little bit in the mountains. We're not used to sunshine this time of year and warm weather, but we actually have it for a change.
All clear, Representative. Thank you.
Very good. Hello, everyone. I spent probably from the time I was 17 years old up until today helping people in different aspects. As you heard before, I was started as a volunteer firefighter, and much of my community that wound up getting flooded was the area that I served as a volunteer. So I kind of knew what we were facing as the storms came along. But I had a lot to learn as a legislator. It's one thing to get in the water and go rescue people and help them after the storm is over with to collect what belongings are salvageable. And I had been in office 8 months, and Tropical Storm Fred came through my community. And when it came through my community, it did a lot of destruction. And that was the first time I had ever had to try to figure out how to put it back together. I had always known someone did that, but now the role found mine. So I was very fortunate. A lot of folks in the General Assembly had experienced that in their community. So I went and talked to several of those. They set me on the right path. And from August until October, there was a lot of work done to get funding out there to help folks. Some of it was private roads and bridges. Some of it was home repairs. And going into it, I didn't recognize that this was going to make a difference when Helene struck. By us putting the money forward, there was criteria for the houses to be rebuilt, some of the roads and bridges to be rebuilt. And my county manager, when Helene hit, we had a conversation about a month and a half afterwards, and they had had a chance to evaluate the properties. And most of the properties that we had rebuilt with different resiliency techniques, spanning bridges that were longer. They didn't eat out from under them. So in reality, we lost some porches. We had some homes that had a little bit of water damage on the inside of them, but the vast majority of the ones that we had worked on, homes and bridges, survived in Helene. And that was a great testament to the fact that by the legislature sending money back to help the people, the county was able to do things that ordinary property owners would not have done. And as devastating as Helene, I take it great pride that we were able to change what would have been even worse for my community. So now the resources we have can be directed toward the folks who were not prepared for it. But I also believe that as we move forward, as we're rebuilding, as we're doing things, we're going to do the same model that we did with Tropical Storm Fred. And if we have another storm, or when we have another storm, whichever the case may end up being, things are not going to be quite as bad. And I think that's one of the things that I have learned over the last 5 years in the legislature is you can do things and you can try to do them to the best of your abilities. But if we take flooding seriously, if we take this role the government has assumed to help folks who can't help themselves, and we do it correctly, ultimately, as years go by, we're going to save lives, we're going to save families, we're going to save money, and we're going to keep some of this infrastructure to where it is actually usable immediately after a storm. When we came in, or when I came into the legislature, we were talking about the blueprint, the flood blueprint for North Carolina. And I want to touch on that just a little bit because it has a distinct purpose. I was a former county commissioner when I went, so I understand the limitations on local government. They have a lot of ideas and a lot of things they want to do, but the tax base is just not there in North Carolina for them to be able to do some things that they would love to do. When we did the blueprint, we got about $100 million in there for projects that DEQ could award and started passing the word around to the river basins that were opened up to it. So they were able to actually have a conversation with someone at the state, tell them their idea, let an engineer or a hydrologist go in and work on the situation, figure out a solution that would not impact folks upstream or downstream, and address an issue that had been plaguing these local communities. So far, they have spent the bulk of that money. The last account I had was about 87 million had already been committed into projects that were being worked on. And I believe in the long run, as we have more storms in the center part of the state or on the coast, that we're going to see something positive come out of that. The last thing I'd like to mention is we put $20 million towards resiliency in this last Helene bill. The problem is we had 104 applications with over 90 million in requests. So we're not done yet. We have a lot more that we have to do. So I think as a state legislator, I have learned, and if I could give just a moment of advice, the local folks need our support. The local folks need us to show them that we are leading the way so that they can step in and do things. But we have to walk this mile with them forever. I'm not going to always be in the legislature. So I need to pass this on in a format that the representative that replaces me, if another storm hits in 15 years and they knew nothing about this one, they're able to follow the format that we set aside now as we move forward. So I appreciate the opportunity to be able to address you and to talk to you about some of the things in North Carolina. We don't do everything perfect, but we are doing everything in our power to try to make it to where our storms are not as devastating. They don't cost as much money, and we don't lose the lives. Hurricane Helene took 107 lives when it was all said and done. Hopefully, if we have another storm of this magnitude, I would love to see that number greatly reduced to where we don't see half of those deaths. We know deaths are inevitable. People are going to be caught in harm's way, but hopefully through all the money we're putting forward, 2.1 billion so far, that we're going to be able to make a difference in the outcome.
Representative Pless, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon and sharing your insights from North Carolina. I really appreciate you taking the time, sir. So now we're going to move over to Florida. We're honored to have former House Speaker Chris Sprowls on the call with us. Speaker Sprowls served in the Florida House of Representatives between 2014 and 2022, finishing his tenure as the Florida House Speaker. He led the development and passage of Florida's landmark Always Ready legislation, which is the nation's most comprehensive state-level flood resilience and an adaptation initiative. And this initiative also positioned Florida as a leader in preparing communities for rising flood risks. Speaker Sprowls, thank you for joining us from Florida this afternoon. Look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's great to be with you in Texas 2036 and the American Flood Coalition. It's a real pleasure to listen to Representative Pless talk about North Carolina and everything that him and his community have been through over the last couple of years in the wake of Hurricane Helene. And I can relate, maybe not as much, but enough, Representative, which I'll talk about in a minute. But I appreciate all the work that you and AFC have done to help North Carolina recover. Why Florida? A couple of years ago when I was being designated as speaker, we do it a little weird in Florida where we pick our leaders, 6 years in advance. And I had this opportunity to give a speech about what I wanted to do during the 2 years that I was going to serve as a speaker of the Florida House. And a part of that speech was about flooding. And it really started as basic as, like Texas and like North Carolina, we know we have flooding challenges. We know we live in a state in Florida where we're surrounded on three sides by water. I live in a county that's a peninsula, so I'm surrounded all over by water. And we knew the concern that when our communities flood, the damage that does to people and to property and to our community's vibrancy. So I talked about flooding and how we needed to have a plan, not just a plan for the next storm, but a 30-year plan. When we sit down and we plan out communities and we talk about roads and infrastructure and airports and ports, we don't talk about it in a year or 2 years or 5. We talk about it in 30 years. What's this airport going to look like in 30 years? What's this road? Is it going to be an interchange or a highway in 30 years? And we do that because we realize that things change. Like Texas, we join Texas as a hub for domestic migration, people coming to Texas, like coming to Florida to seek a better life for their families and pathways to prosperity. And that's a great blessing. The downside of that is we have to plan further in the future than even some of our state colleagues across the country have to. And we easily think about that when it comes to roads and airports. But when it came to flooding, if I'm being just totally honest, we didn't. We didn't think of it that way. We thought of it as one-off projects. And even though, like Texas, we have water management districts and we think about water from a watershed perspective, we weren't doing the kinds of things, the kinds of planning and the kinds of investments that we would need to do to really keep our communities safe and to begin that mitigation. So I gave this speech and I talked about wanting to do this and sort of what I've just shared with you. And a few days later, I got a call from the American Flood Coalition, who I didn't know at all. And they said, hey, we'd like to have dinner and talk about, what you said. And so we did. And they, I shared with them what I just shared with you. And And they said, that's awesome. Do you know how you're going to do it yet? And I said, no, I have no idea. I said it because I believe in it, but we haven't figured it out. And I'll give this shout out to them. And now I serve on their advisory board. But if it wasn't for them kind of coming alongside of us in the legislature, we would not have been able to have the wherewithal and the technical expertise to be able to plan out what we did. And what we did was a bill that we dubbed Always Ready, right? Because like Chairman Perry said, we care about the things that don't matter until they do, right? And that's the reality of it. Listening to Representative Pless talk, I think about as a legislator after a storm, the day after a flood, what would I have been willing to do the day before the flood to mitigate some of the damage and to mitigate some of the risk to people and property if I would have had the wherewithal to do it. And that's what we set out to do and Always Ready. So we came up with a massive plan to set up a statewide resiliency framework, to partner with our communities through matched funds, historic investment, to build out a 30-year plan, to seek what Dr. Ruth talked about with best in class data, to make sure that when we're building and we're planning, that we're using the best data possible, not 25-year-old rainfall data, but the best possible, so that when we build our roads, we build our infrastructure, and we plan our communities, we're doing so in a very thoughtful way. So that's what we sought out to do. And I'll tell you, Jeremy, we were excited when we passed the bill. It was a partnership between the House and the Senate. Turns out flooding is popular, and doesn't matter what political party you come from, because everybody cares about it, and nobody cares about their political party when water's steaming into your community. And so we came up with this, and we passed it, and we began to get to work on sort of these mitigation issues. And much like Representative Pless, I sort of leave office and Hurricane Helene comes. And I live in a community, as I shared with you, that we're a peninsula, and 500 of 600 homes in our neighborhood flooded, including ours. We're still not back in our home. And so I watched devastation happen to communities, to middle-class families, many of whom didn't live on the coast, had no flood insurance, weren't required to have flood insurance, and sort of saw their financial lives, truly, truly devastated. And I will tell you that, as I shared before, when that happened, there's things that you go back to in your service, whether that's public service because you were elected, whether it's because you work for a member or you work for a water management district, but you hearken back to, okay, when I had my hands on the controls, when I was in the arena, when I was trying to contribute, did I do enough, to mitigate this? And I can tell you there is a satisfaction, even when you're in a situation like I am, where my house was flooded, my children, we had to move out. We saw the children's books that we read to our kids, flooded and destroyed. Even when you're in that situation, you hearken back and you say, you know what? We did everything we could do. And our state is in a much better position today than we would have been otherwise had we not cared about the things that other people didn't think mattered, that they didn't think were politically sexy, but we were willing to put the money in. We were willing to put our skin in the game, and we were willing to have endless conversations about how watersheds work and how we can start to plan for the future. And that is a truly rewarding experience. And as we look back at not just the wins towards mitigation, and we've invested hundreds and hundreds of millions, billions of dollars into mitigation partnerships with our local government. But what we didn't know was that Moody's, our bond rater, would come to Florida. We have a AAA bond rating, I'm sure much like Texas. And they came and they said, hey, one of the reasons that your bond rating is remaining stable, one of the reasons that we're sort of signaling to the marketplace that Florida is a good investment is because of the money that you are putting towards flood mitigation and resiliency, because it sends the message to the market that you care about infrastructure just like you care about roads and airports. And I truly believe, look, as we look across the country, and I say we, Florida and Texas, have an amazing platform. The reality is, if Texas does something, the country stands up and takes notice. When Florida does something, the country stands up and takes notice. And we have this really, really unique opportunity for Florida and Texas to really show the rest of the nation how this is done, how we can plan, and how we can save our people and our property. I'm excited for you and really happy to be able to partner with you, with Texas 2036, and with the AFC to help Texas get this done.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. I really enjoyed hearing your perspective over in Florida. Really sorry to hear about your residence being flooded. I hope you can return home sooner than later. But thank you so much for being here this afternoon. As a reminder to our audience, we're elated that over 100 folks have joined us this afternoon. If you have any questions or comments, please again feel free to enter those into the chat feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And what we will do towards the end is we'll hopefully be able to share those questions with our panelists and get you some answers to what you're thinking right now. So our next panelist will be Jeff Walker. I got to confess, I used to work with Jeff over at the Texas Water Development Board. He worked there for 30 years, including being the executive administrator from 2016 until he retired just last year in 2014. Over Jeff's last 10 years at the Water Development Board, the agency delivered nearly $16 billion in financing for water infrastructure projects in Texas. Also, Jeff oversaw the implementation of the first ever state flood plan, which is a program that was initiated by the legislature back in 2019. Jeff, it's great to see you again. Thank you for being here this afternoon.
You too, Jeremy. We have both have the same hairdresser. Yeah.
Yes, we got the memo on what the haircut.
Yeah. Like Jeremy said, I spent nearly 35 years at the Water Development Board, but truthfully, only the last 5 or 6 were on flooding. Flooding is kind of the opposite of what we normally dealt with the board. Normally, we're trying to bring water to somebody. With flooding, you're trying to keep it away or drive it away from somebody. So next slide, please. So if you don't know, Texas does have a statewide flood plan. Texas is one of the few handful of states that addresses flooding on a statewide basis. It was great to hear from Florida, North Carolina about what they're doing with flood resiliency. Other states include Louisiana, South Carolina, Virginia that do some kind of flood planning. But the Water Development Board adopted the first statewide flood plan in 2024. The impetus to start flood planning was the Hill Country floods of 2015 and then Hurricane Harvey in 2017. And it was modeled after the state water plan, meaning that it was a bottom-up approach and regional in nature. So when the legislature tasked the board in 2019 with developing the plan in 5 years, we did not anticipate a worldwide pandemic to begin right when we got started. So we hired the director of flood planning, who's Reem Zoon, in person, and then everything else was remote. Rules, guidance, reviewing over 600 volunteer candidates, delivering funds to get started, all that was done remote. And the team, consultants, volunteers did an unbelievable job from start from scratch and get it done in 5 years. So the plan is founded on available data and science and guided by a framework that requires all 15 regional planning groups to identify the flood risk in the region and recommend a solution to address those risks. So next slide, please. So we all know that the vast majority of Texans live within the metro area triangle of Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, San Antonio, Austin, and Houston. However, this map shows every part of Texas has flood risk. From the Panhandle to the Lower Valley, both those areas are very susceptible because due to their flatness and lack of drainage. El Paso is very susceptible to floods. It only rains 10 inches a year, but it all tends to come at one time. And the coastal areas are subject to risk from river and rainfall flooding, as well as storm surge flooding. Hurricane Harvey was a rain event. It would have been very much worse if there had also been surge flooding from the bay to keep that water from draining. Okay, next slide. So the plan was adopted in 2014. So what did it say? Well, almost 1/4 of Texans are in the 100 or 500-year floodplain. Approximately 1 in 6 Texans live or work in known flood risk areas. That's over 5 million people. There are over 1.6 million buildings in these flood risk areas. There are over 9,300 low water crossings, and Texas leads the nation in flood deaths, not a statistic we want to be number 1 in. Regional planning groups recommended over 4,600 flood risk reduction solutions, including additional valuations, projects, and strategies. The total cost of the recommendations is over $51 billion. However, nearly half of that cost is related to the Galveston Coastal Barrier Project at $24 billion. Now, $51 billion is a lot of money, but to give some perspective, the losses associated with Hurricane Harvey were over $125 billion, and that's from one storm. So next slide, please. So what have we accomplished so far? We've got the first statewide flood plan. We've got LiDAR maps for the entire state now. We're almost complete with base level engineering, which gives you a better idea of where the risks are. And when the legislature tasked the board with creating a flood plan, they also appropriated funds to plan and mitigate for strategies and projects. So around $100 million of that went to regional planning process, which includes staff, consultants, modeling, things like that to develop the plan itself. An additional $753 million was for studies, projects, and early warning, or what we call our flood infrastructure fund. And that was in 2019. Another $625 million was appropriated in 2023 for a total of $1.4 billion in project funding. As you can see, over $800 million is allocated and another $320 million is available for this year. So what have we learned? A large majority of the flood maps were out of date and many were available only in paper form. There was a lot that was unknown. The FEMA maps are insurance maps, so they did not give a full picture of the risk or pinpoint mitigation measures. Except for the larger metropolitan areas, most cities and counties do not have a good picture of the flood risk. And as you can imagine, many cities need technical assistance to help them identify such risk. Many entities cannot access funds because they do not have a good plan how to use them. And there's not a good mechanism for flood funding at the city level, especially smaller cities, because they do not have a source of funds for such projects. Like Senator Perry was saying, we've got taps and fees for water. We don't have, very few areas have taps and fees for flood. And unfortunately, flood was again at the forefront in Texas this last summer, so it received a lot of press and attention. While warning systems evacuation plans are high on the list, additional technical assistance and mapping studies are still needed, as well as affordable funding for smaller communities. So Texas has come a long way in addressing flood risk and mitigation, but it's the first step in a long and expensive journey.
Thank you, Jeff. I remember the 2019 session when the legislature created the state flood plan and the planning process, as well as the FIF. And I think a lot of the impetus for doing that in 2019 was certainly in response to what we saw from Hurricane Harvey, as well as the hill country floods that occurred in, I think, was it 2017 or 2018? But we had a series of flood events that really certainly galvanized the legislature to better organize the state for success when it comes to flood. So thank you for being here.
You know, one thing that really helped before the flood plan was even impetus of the legislatures. In 2017, they tasked us to go out and see what was needed. Mm-hmm. We did a statewide tour of all across the state and asked people, what do you need? And we really found that drove the money in 2019, because people didn't know what they had. They didn't know what they needed. They didn't have maps. They needed information. They needed information. So a lot of that really helped us drive where the money should go to in the funding cycle.
And it's remarkable that the Water Development Board has published our first ever state flood plan that came out last year. And we can certainly, if you guys want to ever want to see that, it's available on the Water Development Board's website. We can perhaps put the link in the chat in a bit. So now we'll move on to our question and answer portion. Before doing that, I would like to introduce Ann Brody, who's with the American Flood Coalition. Ann is the State Government Relations Director at AFC. Ann, if you wanted to pop on and say hi and introduce yourself.
Hello, and thank you for that introduction. You now know who I am and what I do for AFC. I think the other thing I'd like to share is the why behind why I do what I do. Like many of the other speakers that you heard from today, I grew up in a flood impacted community. I grew up in Pascagoula, Mississippi, which is on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And when Hurricane Katrina hit, the house I grew up in, which was not in a floodplain, took on 8 feet of water. And so for me, that was the catalyzing event that got me interested in flood policy and ultimately led me here to AFC, where I now get to help other states build resilience so that communities like the one I grew up in do not get devastated by the next flood.
Thank you for being here, Ann. I think we'll go to Q&A, and I see we have a couple questions in the chat. And so we'll field these to the panelists, and I guess whoever wants to opine on the questions is welcome to do so. The first question we have has to do with actually homeowners insurance. I think that's a pretty significant issue, certainly here in Texas, where we've seen homeowners insurance premiums go up substantially over the past 5 years. due in part to increased extreme weather risks, such as those attributable to flood events. And I guess the question for the panel is, do investments in flood protection and mitigation in the long run help lower risks that also drive down insurance premiums?
I'll start there, Jeremy. I think the answer is yes, right? I think when we're talking about flooding, it's always a little more complicated, right? Because so many people are on the National Flood Insurance Program, and what does that really mean as far as your insurance rates are concerned? But I think let's talk sort of above that, right? Let's talk about reinsurance. The companies who are insuring insurers, right? And when we look at Florida, when we talk to our reinsurers, and they say, look, we're the umbrella policy for the insurance companies, and we care a great deal about the investments that you're making in resiliency because when things, when there's the hurricane or the massive flood or the wind event or God forbid, all those things all at the same time, which we sometimes experience in Florida, we care a great deal as a reinsurance company about how we measure your risk. So I had a conversation with, Swiss Re, for example, a number of years ago, which is a big reinsurer out of Switzerland. And we had this conversation and we were talking about the bill that we were proposing. And they could say, look, we're modeling Florida now and it's not good. And so every dollar that you're putting into resiliency is going to change that model, right? We get to back off sort of the large hikes that we make on insurance companies. And let's be honest, those companies are not going to eat that, right? That's getting passed along even through the regulatory process to the customer and the consumer. So you may not see it on your bill, the cost of reinsurance, but it certainly has an impact on our customers' bill. So I think it's having a significant impact on cost, or at least leveling out costs at a time where affordability is a big challenge. I think the challenge that we have from a messaging standpoint is it so seems esoteric when we're talking about reinsurance and how that meets the customer of whether or not that message is getting to them that they're saving money. But these investments save money before, during, and after an event.
Speaker Sprowls, on the subject of questions, another question that we have in the Q&A is that it's basically, what are the top 3 investments that Florida has made to reduce flooding in the state?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would tell you the 3 that are in my community, right? Because they're the ones I care the most about, like anybody else. I don't think, Jeremy, that I would say this one or that one. There's not like hey, we built this massive wall or barrier like you see in the Netherlands where I could say this one was huge. What I would tell you is that the design of this plan, I think much like the way that they're systematically doing it in Texas, both in funding and systems, is to have the communities drive this, right? So to the point about not respecting political, boundaries, our local communities, our townships or cities or counties or our watershed, our water management districts, they're in the best position to determine, hey, where are our challenges? Where are our pressure points? Where I think the state comes in is where we can require certain standards. We say, hey, we're going to use best in class data. We're going to protect our investment. We want when we spend a dollar to know that we're going to have the impact. So local governments, water management districts, this is the standard by which we expect you to give us this information and then we'll fund, or help fund a project. And so, there's been dozens and dozens of projects throughout different communities. They all matter to them in a significant way. I think the biggest part and the biggest impact is now you have state, local, watershed level districts talking and engaging with one another about the projects. It's not happening in little silos. And also, when they think about the dollar they're going to spend, and they realize that that dollar has the power of $2, if they spend it on a flood project versus a bike path. Not that I love bike paths, right? But I'm getting $2 when I spend it on a flood project. It makes my budgeting a little bit easier, and it incentivizes in a positive way local leaders to do these kinds of projects. And again, if we're being honest, that's why I love folks like Representative Pless and the chairman who spoke earlier, because these aren't, nobody shows up at a ribbon cutting much for a, flood mitigation project, right? It's not going to make the news all the time, but they are the things in a rainfall event where there's a flood or after a hurricane. Those are the frontline projects that truly made the impact for the community.
Mr. Speaker, there's one other question we had for you, and that was, how does your flood preparation follow guidelines from your insurers, including updated building codes and updated flood maps to account for hurricanes and severe rain events?
It's a good question. It's interesting. The insurers really didn't engage much in the process. I don't know if that'll be the same or true in Texas as far as saying, hey, these are guidelines, because what we were requiring in the way of, best in class data and things like that was not from the insurance companies. But thinking through that same process, how do we get to the right guidelines? Because if there was an opportunity, Jeremy, to say, I'm just going to press a button and I all of a sudden had the best data in the world, I would have done it. If they said, hey, you could get the best data in the world, but it's going to cost you $25 million, I would have done it. It wasn't there for us, right? So what we did was we set up a standard by which we're going to collect all of this data. So one of the investments we made, for example, was we set up a flood hub at the University of South Florida, really to study this, to help inform the data that we have. So when we have insurance companies and they have data, we can get some access to those, but it's not necessarily the best that we can have. The best that we can have is data that we collect from our communities that continuously informs the decision that we make. Back in the day, Governor Jeb Bush used to have a saying as it related to education. Reform is continuous and success is never final.
Right.
And that is how I view as we handle this with flooding, because data begets more data. It changes over time. Rainfall changes over time. So what we really set out to do was to say, let's set up a system by which we are continuously collecting that information. We are continuously raising the bar. And by the way, we're doing that in Florida. You know, everything that we set up wasn't perfect. And we sort of set it up, and now we've learned, okay, you know what? We can come in and we can tweak that. We could get better information. Better input means better output, means better projects, which means better impact when the flood event happens. So that's what we're doing. This is a continuous exercise, which is why it's so important that folks like you and the folks on this call, are here and learning about it, because it takes a sort of a legacy generation of leaders to continue this work so that it becomes embedded in our DNA, that this is just what we do. We just collect the best we can, and we do the best we can based on the best data that we have to mitigate this risks to our community.
So we have a few other questions in the Q&A relating to nature-based flood mitigation. And I guess the question for the panel here is, what are other states doing to promote nature-based flood mitigation solutions?
You can take that one, Ann.
Yeah, happy to. And Jeremy, thank you so much for that question. And thank you to the person who asked it. Nature-based solutions can be really effective and also oftentimes beautiful community assets that incidentally also help to protect against flooding. And at the American Flood Coalition, we have got our Adaptation for All guide, which really dives deep into different types of flooding solutions for many different types of communities. And we'll make sure that we drop that into the chat so that you have the opportunity to take a look at some of the projects that have already been successful. And then also, of course, our entire team here at AFC would love to talk one-on-one with you about specific nature-based solutions that might be a good fit for your community.
Thank you, Ian. Another question we have here is, I guess, again, for the panel, is that what should Texas legislators be focused on over the interim in preparation for the 2027 session?
I'd like to add to that a little bit of that. So one of the things they need to do is continue to fund and support technical assistance and that includes, mapping, consulting, staff to help communities. There's over 1,200 flood managers in Texas, and some of them hold 3 or 4 hats. I mean, it may be the mayor, it may be the city manager, and flood is just another project of theirs, and they don't know what to do with that. So the board has some staff through the CAP program that helps technical assistance. They need more funding for that, because the only funding they get right now is through FEMA.
I really agree with your comments there on technical assistance capacity, Jeff. I think, not only for flood resilience, but also in terms of trying to bridge the gap between state financial assistance programs and small and rural communities for water infrastructure. TA is that critical element that we need. We have another interesting question in the chat. How do policies and funding address differences between rain-induced flooding and sea level rise? They seem like different problems.
Yeah, I'll take that one as well, Jeremy. And you are right. They are two different problems, and yet they both cause significant flooding. And it is important to have that forward-looking data so that you can project where those events are likely to happen and can identify the solution that is going to make the greatest impact in reducing flooding in those areas. And that's exactly why there really is no one size fits all solution to flooding because not only is each state's challenges differently, but each community's challenges are different. And so, in gathering that data and identifying where those vulnerabilities are, it's also really important to fold those vulnerabilities into future development plans so that as population is growing, as economic development begins to boom, and you are developing in new areas, you are understanding the risk and how that risk scales relevant to that development, and you can make smart choices to mitigate that risk.
Thank you, Anne. Another question that we have, I think we have time for two more questions. One is actually Florida specific, so it's back to you again, Speaker Sprowls. Can y'all share a little bit about Florida's investment in conservation easements for flood damage mitigation?
I don't always link those two things together. We do a lot of, conservation easements in the state. Mostly it's focused on development, right? Which certainly has a link to flooding. And very much of it is dealt with in sort of rural Florida. So we did a whole conservation corridor in the middle of the state to sort of protect Florida. And a lot of that has to do with buying development rights. Mostly from farmers, who, it's getting harder and harder to have the economics to run farms. So with the state has come in and sort of bought the development rights in order to keep that farm agriculture based and keep sort of a natural part of Florida. But I also think there was a question in the chat. I'll just hop on real quick, Jeremy, which I think builds on this a little bit, which is about funding mechanisms. And so, one of the things that we did was we had, fees on dock stamps, which had to do with, certain conservation and things like that. So, we had a dedicated funding stream for a number of years. And myself and the Senate president said, what makes sense sort of long term is to really split these funding sources into thirds. It was a third for the original dedicated purpose, a third for septic to sewer conversion, largely about water quality, right? Getting sort of contaminants out of the water that was creating dangerous algae blooms and so forth. And then the last part was flood mitigation. So we committed a dedicated funding source inside the budget, recurring funding source specifically to fund these projects at a minimum annual threshold, which I think the minimum is $100 million. So theoretically speaking, we start the budget at $100 million and try to build from there. We seeded it with over $500 million when we started the program, in large part because we have a massive backlog, as you can imagine, of projects that we can continue to do for decades to come. So I do think those dedicated funding sources are really important so that, it's really hard doing legislative wrangling every budget cycle. There's massive amounts of priorities. So, just as I've sort of messaged to members, we don't come in and we don't cut, the Department of Transportation trust fund because we can't afford not to move our people across the state effectively and efficiently with our roads. We have to have the same level of, of confidence and protection around the money that we allocate to flood mitigation.
Thank you, Mr. And did anyone else have any insights from the panel about federal funding coming into question? Where should states and communities look for additional resilience funding?
Well, there's like I said, there's another $300 million available this year through the Water Development Board for different projects, anywhere from planning to projects to early warning systems. So hopefully, and with the legislature appropriating $1 billion a year starting in 2027, I think, part of that can go to flood too.
Thank you, Jeff. Ann, did you have something right there?
Yes, Jeremy, I would be remiss if, to the funding question point, I did not make a shameless plug for what I think is one of the most incredible resources that has been developed at the American Flood Coalition, which is our flood funding finder. And it's at floodcoalition.org/funding finder. And it is a choose your own adventure resource to help identify sources of funding that are available for specific projects that a community may have in mind. And Jeremy, I'll work with you to make sure we're able to get that resource out to the participants today.
Absolutely, Ann. We'll do that. So it is 2 o'clock. We want to honor our commitment to have an hour-long webinar. On behalf of Texas 2036, I want to thank our friends at the American Flood Coalition for collaborating and doing this today. I think it's been a fantastic, informative event. It's not every day that we in Texas get to hear insights from leaders from other states, not only at the coalition, but from North Carolina and Florida. So thank you for this endeavor. I've put my contact information as well as Ann's contact information on this slide. We'll make this available to all participants, and I think we should, if the technology works, we have a recording as well that we'll put up on the Texas 2036 website. In the meantime, thank you for your time. Thank you for coming. Pray for beneficial rain, but not a flood. Thanks for coming.